Thank you, Vidyadharka, for such a warm and welcoming introduction. And I must say that was quite a way to enter into a talk. Never quite had that experience before. And something that the LBC does so well. Thank you. And I just want to say as well that I do feel it is a real privilege to be here and be talking to you on Padmasambhava Day. As Vidyadharka said, the LBC does feel like my spiritual home. And it's wonderful to be here with some very old friends and many people that I don't know at all. Really good to think and see the generations passing through the LBC. Yeah. So what I do need to say is I've come here in a little bit of a rush and I've got palpitations. It's all the excitement. So I will be just gradually calming down, I hope. Yes, so start at the beginning. I wanted to start by giving a bit of background to the text that I'll be speaking on, which you have a copy of. It doesn't mean you have to read it, by the way. It's something to take home with you so that you've got something to look at and reflect on after. So, some background that's a mixture of history and myth. So I know you've been hearing quite a bit about the life of Padmasambhava. I don't know exactly what you've heard, but in the 8th century Tibet, King Trisondetson was trying to bring the Dharma to Tibet. And at that time, Tibet was surrounded by highly civilized Buddhist states, but the indigenous shamanic Bon religion of Tibet was hostile to Buddhism. So the king invited Shantarakshita, a revered scholar monk and teacher from the great University of Nalanda in India, to spread the Dharma in Tibet. But shortly after he'd done a kind of teaching tour, giving talks about the Dharma in different places, an epidemic broke out in the country. And the Bonists declared that the demons were angry because of the introduction of Buddhism. So Shantarakshita advised the king to invite Padmasambhava to come from Nalanda. Padmasambhava was also a scholar and eminent philosopher at Nalanda University, but in addition, he was a yogi in the sense of a meditator, a mystic, and a magician. So Padmasambhava is sometimes referred to as the second Buddha. But Urgyen Sangharakshita, Bhante, has an interesting take on this title. He says that within the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, over aeons of time, each Buddha who appears, once the Dharma has died out, is succeeded by a guru. So Bhante says, it's as though the guru represents the need within Buddhism to follow up the Buddha's initial teaching by attempts to reach down and tackle the very much deeper, almost primordial energies which have been stirred up by the fact that the Buddha's teaching has been introduced into the world. So this morning, at the beginning of the festival day, I was sitting there at the back in the middle, and I had a very good view of this shrine, which is exquisite. And I was looking at the golden Buddha Rupa and the painting of Padmasambhava and the smaller Rupa below it. And this perspective of Buddha and Guru seemed very clear visually. It was as though I was responding to the Buddha Rupa with heart and mind. And I responded to the image of Padmasambhava with heart and belly, or abdomen. So it was somewhere in the guts. There was the serenity of the Buddha and the intensity of Padmasambhava. Yet both represent and embody the full awakening of the enlightened heart-mind, of wisdom, compassion, and energy. And so they are non-different. And Bhante goes on to say, in that same quote, your Buddhism has, so to speak, to become tantric, to cope with and integrate those energies which your earlier, more rational and ethical involvement with Buddhism has stirred up. So we can experience this both as individuals needing to integrate the emotional and psychological depth charges which the Dharma throws up. As an example, we only need to think of the teachings of the three Lakshanas, that everything in our experience is impermanent, without any substantial essence, and ultimately unsatisfactory. But we can also imagine and experience perhaps the effect in a community, in a culture, and how the resistances on a more collective level might manifest. So Padmasambhava as guru was able to break through to a deeper level and contact the forces of the Tibetan unconscious, bringing the Bon deities and their forces into the framework of Buddhism as fierce Dharma protectors, and their energies into the spiritual life of the Tibetan people. We need access to all our energy in order to break through to deeper spiritual levels. And Vidyadhaka has been speaking during the day of Padmasambhava as a force which we can call on to help us work with our limitations and our reactions. Padmasambhava transformed the demons rather than suppressing or repressing them. So the Guru communicates the Dharma in a way that is more immediately accessible to the culture and the time, and brings a visionary perspective of transformation. So Padmasambhava is the teacher or the aspect of Buddhahood which transforms and channels those inchoate energies in pursuit of the good. So what does he teach? We might think his teachings will be very dramatic. Indeed, the descriptions of his magical powers are dramatic. But a more accurate description of his teaching might be that it is uncompromising, thoroughly uncompromising and unequivocal, because his perspective is that of reality, the perspective of reality in relation to the samsara. So you might have heard during the day of his first meeting with King Trison Detsen? No. Okay, so his first meeting with King Trison Detsen, who has invited him to Tibet. He decides not to bow to the king on meeting him, even though he is there at his invitation. But there's no trace of ego in this decision. He simply knows that the power of the Dharma is greater than the power of royal privilege. And since he himself has realized the Dharma and is the bringer of the Dharma, he is simply asserting that truth. And the king, despite his own pride, finds himself bowing to Padmasambhava. And one of the most well-known teachings of Padmasambhava is, "My view is higher than the sky, but my attention to actions and their consequences is finer than flower." and also ascend with the conduct, descend with the view. So his view, his perspective, is higher than the sky because he is enlightened, at one with reality. But that does not in any way underestimate the importance of ethical practice in order to give rise to that purity of mind that can receive the view. It's sometimes described as a clean cloth taking the dye. And without the view, teachings become instructions on behavior. If we lose the view in the conduct, a formalism develops, and there's no opportunity for liberation. If we lose the conduct in the view, we can stray into deluding ourselves that there's no need for ethical practice, because we have understood that the self or agent is empty of inherent existence. So the teaching of Padmasambhava is both down to earth, immediate, accessible, and challenging, as well as coming from a depth of wisdom, compassion, and energy. And who is Padmasambhava teaching in this particular extract we'll be looking at? He's teaching Yeshej Sogyal. So Yeshej Sogyal was of noble birth and initially became one of the queens of Trisondetsen. Her name means victorious ocean of wisdom. And she's traditionally regarded by Tibetans as an emanation of the Dakini Vajrayogini. Other sources describe her as an emanation both of Prajnaparamita and Aryatara. So she's clearly an exceptional woman, whatever her origin. She embraced a life of renunciation and became a disciple and consort of Padmasambhava. In a later teaching which he gives her shortly before he leaves Tibet, he exhorts her to give up any sense of ownership of food, clothing, achievements, relatives, and friends, and with nothing of your own left to you, depend only on what is necessary. Since absolutely nothing useless will arise, the endless wandering of the mind will be conquered. So he does not compromise his teaching in any way because she is a woman or of noble birth. And it is said of Yeshej Sogyal that this is a quote from the introduction to the advice from the Lotus Born. She served Padmasambhava perfectly in that life, engaged in sadhana practice with incredible perseverance, and attained a level equal to Padmasambhava himself. A continuity adorned with inexhaustible qualities and activities of body, speech, and mind. Her kindness to the inhabitants of Tibet surpasses the imagination, and her compassionate activity continues unceasingly. She was also like Ananda, in that she had what was described as unforgetting recall, and was the chief compiler of Padmasambhava's teachings, subsequently concealing them as terma treasures, as instructed by him. It is said that Padmasambhava could see the 3 times, past, present, and future. So he could see what type of teaching would be suitable for future generations, as well as the periods of time during which the Dharma would be suppressed. The termas were concealed in rock and water until the meaning became visible in visionary experience to the Terton, the revealer of the terma, the revealer of the treasure, who themselves were greatly revered. So there's a saying that when the flames of the dark age rage rampantly, the teachings of the Vajrayana will blaze forth like wildfire. And at the end of the text, which is the advice from the Lotus Born, Padmasambhava describes an age when the teachings of the Buddha Shakyamuni will fade like shadows at dusk. When study and teaching of the Dharma in the world will decline, and those who reflect and meditate will be scarcer than stars at dawn. When the king's law will not be recognized and ethical principles will dissolve. When qualified teachers will be hard to find and species of different animals will be nothing more than tales from past generations. And he goes on to say, at that time, those who practice my advice will benefit both themselves and other people of future generations. Therefore, Tsogyal, for the sake of people in the future, commit this to writing and conceal it as a terma treasure. So I'm sure we can all feel resonances in our present culture of this dark age, and how much we need faith and confidence in the practice of the Dharma in the face of so much conflict and uncertainty. And we can see what the significance of termas and tertons have for us in the present. The Buddha laid down principles through conceptual teachings, stories, and images. More meanings have been revealed over time, relevant to the period and the culture the Dharma is meeting. Bhante, Urgyen Sangharakshita, has been our major terton, communicating the Dharma in ways both relevant to the West and to contemporary Indian culture. Some teachings previously obscure or almost literally hidden in the vast store of Buddhist texts that have been brought to light by him and have ignited the hearts and minds of people across the world. So we are recipients of this terma treasure, and specifically this afternoon of Padmasambhava's advice to Yeshe Tsogyal to never be apart from the conditions for faith to arise. So I need to ask the question now, what is faith? Shraddha, which is the Sanskrit term. And first of all, to say what Shraddha is not. Very important, this. So Shraddha is not blind belief. It's nothing to do with being gullible, unquestioning, or naive. The Sanskrit root comes from a term, oshrad, which means truth, truthfulness, and is also the root of the English word heart. So we could speak of Shraddha as meaning to place the heart upon, which is the way of speaking about it that Bhante often refers to. And in Buddhism, obviously, heart and mind are not separated as they are in Western culture. As well as the meaning of truth, the term Shraddha also carries meanings of calmness and composure of mind, assent to, longing for, to welcome and be desirous of, curiosity, intimacy, reverence, respect, and inspiring of confidence. So, a little about what Shraddha is in Buddhist teachings. I'm sure you've all heard the saying or the teaching, faith is the seed, practice is the rain. So the seed contains the whole genetic makeup of the flower or tree in potential. But without the necessary conditions, the rain and the sun, it will never sprout and come to fruition. But without the seed, nothing will sprout. So we could understand this in two ways. If we don't have faith, then there's no way forward. I'll be coming back to this from my own experience. Or we could understand it as saying that faith is inherent in each of us, but needs recognition and needs to be nurtured and developed. And Bhante describes this inherence of faith as what is ultimate in us, resonating with what is ultimate in the universe. And Shraddha is also the first step on the spiral path, itself one of the teachings of the Buddha that Bhante has brought to light for us. The first step on the path that can lead to increasing states of integration and happiness, taking us into the realization of insight and beyond, ultimately, to the full awakening of enlightenment. So samsaric existence is an existence of successive states of mind, endlessly repeated. Samsara is not a place, but something we do. We samsarize. In reactive states of mind driven by craving, ill will, and delusion. And these states of mind, in turn, create the experience of our world. To a certain extent, we are helpless in this. Samsaric existence is sometimes described as an overwhelming flood or torrent. But there is a point of freedom in all of this where we can escape. And Padmasambhava says, Sogyal, to escape samsaric existence, you must have faith in the path of liberation. So when a pleasant or painful feeling arises, if we can simply sit with it in awareness, rather than reaching out to distract from the discomfort or to prolong the pleasure, if we can sit with that discomfort, that sense of impermanence, then something else can happen. We're no longer entirely swept along by the flood. And this sitting in awareness is described as the place of the spiritual warrior. And here, faith, Shraddha, the first step on the spiral path, can arise. Then there are two images from a sutra called The Questions of King Milinda. So the king asks the sage Nagasena, what is the mark of faith, of Shraddha? And his response is, faith makes serene and it leaps forward. So the king asks, how does faith make serene? And Nagasena replies, when faith arises, it arrests the 5 hindrances, and the heart becomes free from them, clear, serene, and undisturbed. And when the king asks again how this happens, Nagasena says that faith is like a magical water purifying gem, which causes muddy water to become pure and fit to drink. And the king then asks, how does faith leap forward? And Nagasena describes a river overflowing in heavy rain, and a crowd of people fearful to cross, unable to know the depth of the river, standing hesitating on the bank. And then a person comes along who, conscious of their own strength and power, well, actually, the sutta says they jump across, but I couldn't quite reconcile myself with that image. So what I've said is that they plunge in, reaching the further bank. And the crowd of people, seeing that person on the further bank, likewise are able to cross. So faith clarifies. And if you have faith, you can leap forward. There's energy and confidence. You can move towards what you have faith in. Then traditionally, 3 aspects of faith are described. There's trusting faith, a deep conviction of what is real and true, which involves intuition as well as reason. It's the experience you have when you hear Dharma teachings, the principle of conditionality, the law of karma, that actions have consequences, and you resonate deeply, and you know in your being that what you are hearing is the truth. It's why many of us are here at the centre. We have within us, on some level, that trusting faith. And then there's lucid faith. This is faith which purifies the mind, the water-purifying gem which exposes our unskillful states of mind and reveals more clearly what we value. And Bhante says in relation to lucid faith that it introduces a certain order and clarity into one's mind and into one's life, so that we see more clearly what we really wish our lives to be about. And then longing faith. And this is a confidence in one's own potential, that one can practice effectively and move towards full awakening, that there's no ceiling on what is possible. And this is perhaps where we stumble. Again, Vijaydaka was talking earlier, and just before the talk, about our wish to practice and yet it not being easy. What is easy is to compare oneself with others, that others can do it, but not me. And last of all, faith prefigures wisdom. Shraddha heralds prajna. It's not only that faith is the beginning of the path, but it grows into wisdom. It activates and unites emotion, intuition and reason all together, so that the whole of ourselves can be engaged in practice. So I want to talk a little here about my own experience. I was particularly drawn to this text by the second line. Faith arises through causes and conditions and not on its own. This line and the whole text of this teaching from Padmasambhava marked a sort of turning point for me. So my family conditioning was strongly socialist and atheist. My belief was that there was just this life, and what was important was to contribute towards making the world a better place. Religion was a deluded state of mind, and some version of it being the opium of the people, a way of keeping people in their place and promising them that the fruit of their life and work would arise in some heaven realm after death. So that's where I started from. So coming to the LBC 40 years ago, I had a strong response to the truth of the Dharma. An equally strong response to the institutions of the LBC, as Vidyadhaka said, I quickly joined the team at the restaurant and started to live in one of the women's communities. I came regularly to classes and became friends with others in the Sangha, and I was one of the people who started up a business called Bodywise, an alternative health centre that became very successful for a few years. But I was very wary of the idea of anything religious. I was very wary of joining a group. I was very skeptical of any idea of spiritual hierarchy, and I was bemused by the whole idea of faith, which I sort of lumped in with religion. But at the same time, I was engaged, at the same time, I was engaged and enthusiastic and wary and skeptical. So you could say I was confused from Bethnal Green. And it took many years and lots of questions before I asked to be a mitra. But I was determined to realize the truth of the Dharma, and I didn't really think I needed any help to do that. So I decided to go on a month-long solitary in the south of Spain at a retreat centre called Osel Ling. I think this may have been before becoming a mitra. I'd only been on a week's solitary previously, but I was determined that on this one I would break through to insight. I had my little hut on the side of the mountain and settled in to 3 weeks of being in the hell realms. I was assailed by grief, anger, despondency, at times despair. In a word, dukkha. And at one point I wrote to Bhante saying that I had no doubt about the truth of suffering, but I could not see how to move from suffering to faith. I knew the map of the wheel and the spiral path, I knew the theory, but I could not even take the first step. So on my return, I started to feel that others had something I didn't. I remember a conversation with a friend in the course of which I realized that she had an intuitive confidence of a kind of beneficence flowing through the universe, which I entirely lacked. And I began to feel not only my own lack, but an envy of those who seemed quite naturally to have faith. I even began to think that maybe it was easier for those who had been brought up in some religion. At least they seemed to be able, having rejected God, to transfer some sense of the transcendental into Buddhist faith. So we then jump a number of years, many years, living in a community, engaged at the LBC, and one day I was feeling quite low. So I thought, right, what I need to do is go for a walk. So I went for a brisk walk in the park. And then, still feeling low. So I thought, I know what I need to do. I need to talk to my friends. I need to talk to a friend. So I went back to the community, knocked on the first door, went in, said something maybe foolishly like, "Oh, how are you today?" And this person then held forth at how difficult they were finding life. So I thought, okay, stayed for a little while, knocked on the next door, and the same thing happened. Again, I foolishly must have made the wrong introduction. So the last resort, I thought, I'll go and meditate. So it was interesting that it was the last resort in my own mind. And at that time I had a connection with Vajrasattva, which I still have. And so I sat down and in a way I kind of called on Vajrasattva. And he appeared in a way that he'd not appeared before, just full of compassion and kindness in his whole being. And before I knew it, I was in second dhyana and full of joy and bliss. So it was just quite extraordinary. And I thought, oh, I see now, kindness is the key to move from dukkha to faith. And I wrote again to Bhante and said that I'd discovered it. And I often wonder whether that's the reason that he gave me my name, Maitreyi, the kindly one, because although, as Vijaydaka said, I was amongst the first women to be ordained by women, Bhante gave us our names on that occasion. So, and the last experience is at Akashavana. And at this time, I'm a preceptor. I'm a public preceptor. So how long it can take for conditioned views to shift. And Padmasambhava, who was leading the retreat, asked me to lead a going forth puja on faith, Shraddha. And quick as a flash, I said to her, oh, I think it'd be better to ask someone else. I'm not really a faith type. But Padmasambhava is a wise woman, and she said, oh, just think about it over meditation and let me know at supper. So, during the meditation, 3 readings came into my head, which could be the readings for that puja. So the first was from Know Your Mind, and it was Bhante talking about that the greatest test of faith is when you can continue to practice even when you're not experiencing any fruits or any obvious fruits. You may feel bleak, you may be flat, but you continue to practice in whatever way. The second reading that came to mind was Pingyir's praises to the way to the beyond. I won't go into that. And the third was this reading from the Lotus Born. And as it was being read by somebody else in the puja, I really heard what was said by Padmasambhava, that faith arises through causes and conditions and not by itself, or not on its own. And that those causes and conditions, I realized that those causes and conditions had been very fully in my life for many years. And I did, and I do, have faith. So Padmasambhava says to Yeshe Tsogyal, to escape samsaric existence, you must have faith in the path of liberation. Not simply faith in the Buddha, but faith in the Dharma, faith in the path you are on, faith in your context for practice. So this is a big one, because it's about commitment. In his paper on what is the Western Buddhist order, or we could say now, what is the Triratna order, Bhante advocates the need for intensity and says that for our practice to have depth, it has, in a sense, to be narrow. And he goes on to say, my approach stems from the nature of spiritual life itself. For commitment to be strong, it has, in a sense, to be narrow. It is only through intensity of commitment and practice that you achieve any results. You will not achieve that intensity if you try to follow different teachers and their different teachings and practices at the same time. You need to follow a particular set of teachings and practices within a particular framework, under a particular teacher, in order to experience any real progress. So I've thought about this a lot and had many conversations with people who have been concerned how they can know if Triratna is the right context for them. And my response is that the practices, the teacher, and the Sangha only have to be good enough. There has to be a good enough context to which you bring your commitment. That intensity of commitment and practice is what will give progress. If we're looking for a perfect teacher, we will need to be perfect disciples or perfect students. If we're looking for a perfect Sangha, we will need to be a perfect spiritual friend. And then there are 2 lines about faith, about how faith arises on the basis of suffering. Faith arises when being in painful difficulties. Faith arises when seeing the suffering of another being. So we usually see painful difficulties as an obstacle and try to avoid them. In an earlier reading which we had here this morning, Padmasambhava says, instructing in meditation, lay bare whatsoever arises, good and bad thoughts alike. So we need to sit with the dukkha and recognize its universality. It can take many, many years of practice to really accept the first noble truth that there is dukkha, and it really is part of the human condition. A friend of mine who recently did a long solitary retreat of 6 months and was experiencing just how much dukkha there had been in his life, particularly in the last 20 years, someone who has held a lot of responsibility through difficult times in our order and movement and been on the receiving end of a fair amount of criticism. But he said it was not until this solitary retreat that he had realized deeply enough the fundamental and universal fact of suffering. And that realization was a real liberation. It's easy for us to think that if suffering arises, we must fix it, and that if we can't fix it, we are somehow to blame, or others are to blame. So I talked about my friend who'd done a long solitary retreat, and then it also says, or Padmasambhava rather also says, faith arises when seeing the suffering of another being. So even if we could fix our lives so that we do not suffer, how could we really steer a way through life without pain when we see others suffering? It brings home the universality of suffering and makes us realize that we cannot hold ourselves separate. It goes against reality. And we need to look no further than Shantideva, who expresses this most profoundly in the Bodhicharyavatara. Though I cannot experience another's suffering in myself, his suffering is hard for him to bear because of his affection for himself. I should dispel the suffering of others because it is suffering like my own suffering. I should help others too because of their nature as beings, which is like my own being. Without exception, no sufferings belong to anyone. They must be warded off simply because they are suffering. Why is any limitation put on this? And then faith arises when contemplating the defects of samsaric existence. So if something is defective, it doesn't work very well. Samsara doesn't work very well. And so much of our energy goes into strategies for attempting to fix samsara. We're just affected by things not working out the way we plan, not being what we expect, feeling let down or feeling betrayed by other people. But it is life that betrays us if we don't open to the truth of impermanence and insubstantiality. So contemplating impermanence, insubstantiality, and taking that reflection deeper when not in the midst of suffering. Even in the midst of pleasure, we can ask ourselves, is this enough? It will end. And recognizing that even samsara at its best cannot satisfy the longings of the human heart. So that's probably quite a good place to stop, but I will just say to finish that what struck me reading through this text and what are the conditions for faith to arise, that every single one of those conditions is either here at the centre, at the LBC, or it's in your study groups, or it's in your Mitra study groups, or it's in the order in the form of the refuge tree of the Triratna Buddhist order. In the refuge tree we have faith arising when hearing the life examples of the lineage masters, or when we hear the Vajra songs of realization, when we go on retreat from the Adana, the Terigata, Milarepa, the songs of the Siddhas. And faith arises when making offerings at a special shrine. Well, there couldn't be a more special shrine today than this one here, which, as I said, I just find exquisite. And but it's not just the shrine that makes it special. It's not just the beauty of the shrine, the aesthetic of the shrine, the attention to detail. It's the effects of being here with all of you gathered together in front of this shrine. It's the Sangha which makes the shrine special, as much as any artistic endeavour that's gone into creating it. It's a special shrine simply for these reasons and for bringing ourselves here. Thank you.